Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought it would be a good time to revisit talking about the current Tsar of Russia, Mr. Putin. What has he been up to lately, Jim?
Well, he's apparently, in theory, he's at the end of his career. I mean, he could do what he did earlier. You can only serve 2 terms as president in Russia, according to the Constitution. And he already did the flip, as it were, where he had Mr. Mendeyev, a close associate, run for president and appoint him prime minister for 5 years, and then he'd go for another 10. Apparently, he's not going to do that. There's not much talk about that. In fact, there's a lot of talk in Russia about who will follow Putin, what will follow Putin. He may just bow out because he's a smart guy, and I think he understands. I mean, we certainly understand that at Strategy Page that Russia is in bad shape. In fact, he's doing worse in the surveys of late, which is unusual because he's basically been a very successful populist. But he basically never recovered from the financial crash of 2008. I mean, he did basically get credit for turning the Russian economy around after the financial disasters of the 1990s. But his moves since, basically 2008 with Georgia and then with Ukraine, with the Middle East, a lot of Russians understand that Russia has no cards to play with. The economy is a mess. They allow, fairly, how should I put it, accurate public, opinion polls to be published. When he was in the KGB in the 1980s, he was familiar with the private polling that the KGB did for the government via their informant network. It was rather unscientific, but apparently pretty accurate. And that showed that, the Russia was coming apart, not just economically, but in terms of the loyalty, as it were, of the Russian people to whoever was currently running the country. And he may see those symptoms again, because Russia is in terrible shape. He has always maintained that they have found ways to overcome the sanctions and the apparently permanent decline in the price of oil. But as a practical matter, the economy keeps getting worse. The surveys of poverty keep showing that more and more Russians are poor. Surveys of intention to immigrate indicate more and more Russians want to get out of Russia, and this is particularly acute among the educated Russians, the ones who are more than happy to get a good job and stay in Russia, but if there are no jobs to be had, well, let's get out of here. So he is faced with a basically unsolvable economic situation. He could, basically just, get out of Ukraine and sort of, make apologies, whatever, and get out from under the sanctions. But he can't. There's no way he can easily fix the oil problem. Like I say, he's a KGB guy, the best and the brightest. In the West, people like that would go into be running corporations, would be lawyers, be entrepreneurs. But in Russia, the only option you really had was to go to the KGB and hope you didn't get shot for, stepping on the wrong toes. The KGB never revived itself. He brought in a lot of his old cronies or veterans of the KGB. He was a junior guy when he retired. He was a lieutenant colonel in, during the 1991 coup. He said he turned in his papers. But he really had no future in the KGB because he jumped into politics and did very well. I think he understood he had a future there. And many of the senior officials in Russia, since the 1990s, have been former KGB men. In fact, they have something of what they call a little mafia of their own. They do understand if you were a KGB man, you were basically, loyal and intelligent, and also fast on your feet. That has not worked out well for Russia because they never made the reforms. They never cracked down on the corruption as much as they had to in order to give Russia a, how should I put it, a world-class economic atmosphere, which they to this day do not have. And I think he realizes that, the end game, it's best that he not be associated with it, because Russia has now become an economic vassal of China. The Chinese now, for the first time in modern history, have a more powerful, a more modern military than Russia does. The latest scandal that he cannot find a fix for is the state of the Russian military, which it recently came out. They tried to keep it secret for years. When they knocked the conscription term down to a year, about a decade ago, under public pressure. They found that 1 year was not enough in most cases to train somebody to do a useful job. Most of those jobs are in the army, and even then, the combat commanders were complaining that the conscripts were even less enthusiastic soldiers than they were during the Soviet Union period, and they could not discipline them, the way the Soviets did. And basically they were lousy troops. And as we pointed out years ago, and I've been taking that into account, the only effective troops, the dependable troops the Russian military has, are about 100,000 special operations, Spetsnaz, airborne, air mobile. These are the troops that they can basically send anywhere to do anything at any time, but that's it. And even at that, the army and the Interior Ministry, the old KGB, the National Police, they're supposed to have a strength of a little over 1 million, and they can't maintain that because the internal police, they also depend upon conscription. And so Russia is basically defenseless. They have their nukes, but that's an all or nothing, weapon. Even the Chinese aren't afraid of the Russian nukes. The Chinese basically have the Russians by the bank book, by their wallet, and there's nothing in the Russian wallet. And of course, the Chinese could at any moment, revive their claims to Far Eastern Russia, the areas around Manchuria, which the Chinese never basically give up those terms. They made that very clear several times during the Cold War, which brought a period of hot war, of border fighting between Russia and China. And even after the Soviet Union, fell apart, the Chinese quietly repeated that they have not given up their claims. So Putin, for all that he's done, he had basically stabilized the economy back when there was more of an economy to deal with. And he has been pretty clever by Russian standards in dealing with Western Europe and many other parts of the world, like the Middle East, but he has nothing to deal with. And now the economy's in decline. There was a golden age before the oil price plummeted and the sanctions came into effect. And that's gone, and he really can't turn that around in the short amount of time he's got left. So his accomplishments are hollow now because of the mistakes he made, and he's got no way to recover. So basically, politically, he has no future and a very cloudy past.
Austin?
Well, remember that the character that Dracula is based on was a guy called Vlad the Impaler. He was a lord, I forget the term that was used. It was in Wallachia in the 15th century. Vlad the Impaler. Well, now we have Vlad the Imploder, is what my joke would be in talking about Putin. I want to clarify something. You go back through some of the forum chats on the strategy page, and you'll see a couple of characters in there who said, Austin Bay thinks Vladimir Putin's a genius. No, I don't. I think he's very, very cunning. And Jim, you said he made lieutenant colonel. What I read about it, he made full colonel in the KGB. If he made lieutenant colonel, fine. He's still a muckety muck, and he's an operative, maybe a junior level. But to carry that kind of rank in the KGB, he's as you acknowledge, he's got to be smart and clever. Now the commenters saying Bay thinks he's a genius is because I pointed out in several columns. Let's start with some really 2008 with the Russia-Georgia war. But you can also go back to some of the things I wrote in my Creator Syndicate column on Point, and also some of the coverage that Jim's had on the strategy page since the early 2000s about Russia, is that Putin has a knack. Jim said he had a political gift. Yes, a political gift for sensing and speaking to some of the desires, especially the grievances of a number of the Russian people. He's done it in terms of economics. He's done it in terms of the loss of the Soviet Union, greatest catastrophe, and that is the translation of that, is the best translation of what he said of the 20th century. I happen to disagree that the loss of the Soviet Union I thought it was one of the better things that occurred in the 20th century. But Vlad and I'll just have to agree to disagree on that. Some of the other things he spoke to, and this was in the 90s, about the security issue with all the attacks by the various Caucasian Islamist extremist groups, and his willingness to confront them. Part of this is also coming and portraying himself as the Russian strongman, the latest Ivan the Terrible Tsar, who will confront Russia's enemies. As a KGB man, he's also a propagandist who, where there aren't enemies, he will create them. He'll turn Estonians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Finns, Swedes. He doesn't want to say Finns and Swedes, but he'll turn Balts and Nordics, Poles, Romanians for sure, and the United States and NATO. They're enemies. Major enemies, and they must be confronted, and he's the man, he's the czar, strong enough to confront them. Now, when I said that I thought he was cunning, I think he follows, this is a classic authoritarian leader's operation. Lenin spoke to it, is that you drive the dagger deep until you encounter something hard. Putin sensed that the United States was overextended in 2008. He was concerned, too, about Georgia joining NATO. Remember, Georgia had a brigade in Iraq at the time. Even though, to go back to July, August of 2008, the surge has begun to succeed and is succeeding in Iraq, but George W. Bush is terribly, under a constant assault by the American media. There is a presidential election going on in 2008 between McCain and Obama. And here was an opportunity to, again, act on behalf of threatened Russian minorities, or pro-Russian minorities. That's what he claimed he was doing in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. That's another theme that plays well, political theme that plays well with a number of constituencies inside Russia. All the Russians lost in the near abroad, in Transnistria, in eastern Ukraine, in parts of Lithuania and Latvia. They're cut off and they need to be returned to the Russian motherland, or certainly they need to be protected by the Kremlin. And that was one of the propaganda pitches in the Russo-Georgia War. Now, a side comment on this, Jim said it's hard to tell how, the real strength and status of Russian forces. They really didn't do very well in the Russo-Georgia War. They learned some things about it. They developed, started to rely even more so on some of their special operations troops, even though they were used heavily in 2008. But they learned some things about fighting a low-level war under, quote-unquote, what the Chinese call informationized conditions. Obama is elected. And then when I say Vladimir Putin sensed his weakness, one of the first things Obama did in September of 2009, and I wrote a column about this at the time, was give up a very important advance in missile defenses that had been negotiated through NATO. There were going to be missiles in Poland and a long-range radar system in the Czech Republic. They were not aimed at Russia. It was for a shot from another direction, meaning Iran is where it was. And Obama cashed them in. Why? Because he says he was resetting relations with between the United States and Russia, as if the Bush administration had been responsible for Russia's invasion of Georgia. That was really a capitulation to the propaganda line that the Kremlin, when Putin, had been pushing. You see this going through. Look, in 2012, Obama got caught with a hot mic in South Korea where he told Medvedev that, he wanted to pass a message to Vladimir that he'd have more flexibility, Obama, after the election. Okay, so Vladimir is Barack Obama's friend? No, he's not. He's a calculating Russian authoritarian leader who, at the time, let's go back to 2012, 2013, Jim mentioned oil prices. It looks like the oil prices are going to be high for a long time. Fair bet that, this is the Kremlin's thinking, that we can modernize our forces, we'll have the cash to do it. At some point, let's do something. And Putin, I think, got some of this at the time, but in retrospect, why Crimea? Crimea was something that the Russians wanted. They had been part of Russia until Khrushchev in 1954 gave it to Ukraine. Didn't really have any defenses there. Russia already had 20,000 sailors and soldiers there because Sevastopol was leased from Ukraine as the Russian Navy's Black Sea base, and he took it, and then he annexed it, and annexing it, as he did on March 18th, 2014, suddenly changed something fundamentally in the way that relations had been stabilized since the end of World War II. Yeah, there have been border scraps, fights over territory, but no one had annexed it. No one had gone that extra step. Well, Russia did it. He was praised in Red Square, and he was on top of the world. Except what kicks in? American fracking, oil prices, oil and gas prices start to fall, and then he goes too far. Jim alluded to this with the trying their hybrid war in Ukraine. Worked for a while, but since 2016, early 2016, really, there has been very little change along the quote-unquote lines or line of destruction, if you look at some of the photos. In the Donbass area, you could argue that Russia's stuck in a quagmire. Jim's made that argument. I have as well. As a matter of fact, I've got in the Cocktails from Hell, I've got a couple of pages looking at the quagmire. I'm putting that in italics, that Russia has enmeshed itself in Ukraine. Part of that quagmire is, as Jim said, sanctions. Sanctions have hurt the Russians as well. And there have been targeted sanctions, some by all members of the West, but by the U.S. and Great Britain, because Great Britain is one of the favorite places for Russian oligarchs to own real estate and go run and have a good time. Well, they blocked them out of that. It's also happened in France and Italy as well. They want to corruption, steal billions from Russia, and then go have a great time and party on the French Riviera. Those are things that have had political effects within secondary oligarchical circle around Putin that holds power, holds sway in Russia. That's part of the fragility, and I'm giving an example here of a certain type of sanction, travel, individual sanction, individual financial sanctions that has ultimately eroded some of Putin's personal power and prestige in Russia. He needs these people, and they're crooked, and the corruption all undermines him with vast swaths of the general population. One other comment too, I mentioned the Nordics. Dan, because of Crimea and Ukraine, now Finland, which, we've joked about this. It's not a joke. The Finns have one of the best reputations, military reputations in the world. They are a little warrior state like Israel and South Korea, and their reserves train all the time. They know who the enemy is, and that's the Russians. They're Finns that talk in public now about joining NATO. That's a complete rejection of what Putin wanted, which was to diminish NATO. Sweden, of all places. It's tough to get an exact grip on this, but there are a couple of Swedish. It was written in English language, but Swedish publications looked at about 2017. 35% of the country favored joining NATO. And there was, this is not news, there were Swedes who will tell you we have been effectively cooperating with NATO for 4 decades, 5 decades, because of their contacts with the Danes, who are part of NATO, and the fact that Danish air controllers have provided the Swedish Air Force with essentially air defense information for years. And the Russians know that. The Swedes have acknowledged, the Swedes have openly acknowledged that. And now, what was it, Trident Juncture, which was the big NATO exercise last November, I believe, winter exercise, involved U.S. Marines and the like. Finland participated, and so did Sweden. That is absolute blowback, and I think Jim would agree, another example of where, like, Vlad is flailing, or as I said, Vlad the Imploder.
Jim, where are some of the areas in the world that the Russians are stirring up problems or have caused problems currently?
Well, it's deja vu to the Cold War. Syria, which was always a major customer for Russian weapons, basically to improve relations with Iran, which is still a important, oil state, as it were. Syria never was. Russia got involved in Syria in 2015. They make no secret of the fact that they're there in large part to show off the latest Russian weapons. They do have some new stuff, especially electronic warfare and what have you, and mid-market, aircraft. They also had smart bombs. GPS and laser-guided weapons, which had never really been used in combat. We knew they existed, and they showed they worked out. But at the same time that they basically turned Syria into a major, how should I put it, marketing event for Russian weapons, they also revealed just how poor the Russian military was. Yes, they had smart bombs, but they had very few of them. Most of the bombs dropped by these modern Russian aircraft, or modernized in many cases, were dumb bombs because they simply didn't have that many smart bombs. And that came out. They tried to keep that secret, but there it was. They had no war stocks, as it were, of these weapons. The aircraft performed fairly well. They also performed in an environment, a modern warfare environment. In other words, the Israelis were there. It's notable, and we point this out again and again, that the Russians maintained good relations with Israel, even though their ally, well, both their allies, Turkey and Iran, are basically very anti-Israel. The Iranians, as we all know, still, have demonstrations about, death to Israel, destroy Israel. The Turks, basically got a Islamic government in 1999, which was supposed to basically clean up the corruption and make things better again. It didn't, but it basically ruined, decades of Turkish diplomacy and economic relations with the West and with Israel in particular. When push comes to shove, the Russians sided with Israel. That was embarrassing for them, but they basically knew, who was the major power there. The rest of the Arab states did the same, mainly because of the threat from Iran. They basically they cut the Palestinians loose for all practical purposes, and said, we're allies of Israel now. That was very difficult to do because, for decades, for generations, these governments have been pumping out anti-Israel propaganda, and now they suddenly have to say, well, hey, we got it wrong, which is a big deal, in that part of the world. So the Israelis basically showed the Russians that, yes, their weapons were credible, but they weren't all that the sales brochures claimed they were. Basically, a lot of potential customers, not the Turks, of course, picked up on that. That the Russian weapons weren't able to stop Israeli air attacks, which were basically using American, in this case, most recently F-35 stealth aircraft. The Russians were rather proud of the fact that they showed off electronic warfare equipment, which basically nobody had paid any attention to. But even during the Cold War, we tended to downplay the impact of their quite credible electronic warfare weapons. So some things never change. But the problem is that the whole Syrian intervention was a mirage. Same thing's going on down in Venezuela. Russia has tried to make deals with Venezuela. Hasn't loaned them that much money, but they basically have an interest, as it were, in maintaining good relations with a country that has the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Unfortunately, they also have a socialist government. You know how that works out. The Chinese, on the other hand, have never sent troops to Venezuela. The Russians have sent some troops, and they've also worked with the Cubans, who are doing most of the heavy lifting, as it were, in terms of shoring up the socialist government's security, which is rapidly eroding. But the Chinese are again showing that they're a lot smarter than the Russians are, or at least have assets, have capabilities that Russia does not have. They are basically there with money more than anything else. Most of the foreign loans the Venezuela has incurred are to China. They are to be paid in oil, and basically China is in there. They have been sending in technical people and equipment and parts to basically repair a lot of the damage that the Maduro government did to their oil industry, basically starving it for all sorts of resources and replacing all the competent people with people who were loyal to Maduro. A classic mistake. The Chinese have pointed that out. The Chinese have also pointed out that they're willing to work with any government of Venezuela. That annoys Maduro, but not so much that he's going to shut the Chinese down, because they're one of his major allies. The Russians, on the other hand, want to be paid in cash, and there's been hanky-panky with the Russians trying to get some of the Syrian gold reserves out of the country in order to pay for last ditch, as it were, security assistance. Especially, most of this is being done via Cuba. I mean, Russia has always, they basically cut off Cuba and North Korea from their generous, Cold War era subsidies, which kept them going. Caused economic collapse in North Korea and Cuba. But since then, Cuba's, tried to recover, and now they're depending upon China and Russia to basically give them whatever they can, and especially restore the socialist government in Venezuela to power, to real power, so that the Venezuelans can keep giving the Russians cheap oil and keeping their government or their economy going. This is, most people don't pay attention to this, but with the decline of the Venezuelan economy, it was even worse in Cuba, because Cubans still depended a lot on basically handouts from Venezuela, and they are largely gone. Because Venezuela is flat broke, and then some. So that's a foreign adventure that the Russians tried. They basically present it as with as brave a face as they can muster, but it's basically a disaster, and it's only going to get worse. But the problem is they don't have many options. They don't have any friends. I mean, the Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, is going to Russia, before the end of this month, the latest news is, to meet with Putin. But there's not much Putin can do. He can help him get around sanctions on North Korea. But even there, Russia is limited because they have a much smaller economy. They are also under sanctions. The United States has shown that we can impose more sanctions. The individual sanctions, as Austin pointed out, are particularly harmful. They basically hit you where you live, because a lot of these oligarchs and the people who basically technically own and operate the majority of the Russian economy, the major industries, especially oil and energy related, they basically want an escape hatch. I mean, what's the good of having all that money if it's all going to blow up and you're going to end up dead? So they need that lifeline, to, especially to Britain or anywhere in the West, where if things go, tits up, as it were, there's an escape hatch. They know what happened to the aristocracy, in the 1920s after World War I, and that is not forgotten. So Russia would like to have more influence in foreign countries, but its only allies are basically a sad sack collection of failures. Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea. With friends like that, who needs enemies? And then, of course, there's Iran and Turkey, which are sort of frenemies. Iran has historically been an enemy. They still are, in terms of what the Iranians think of Russia. And it's basically a very tenuous relationship, mainly because Iran needed support, military support in Syria, where they could provide an army of basically lightly equipped infantry, mercenary infantry, that the Iranians recruited, but they had no air support, and that's what the Russians provided, and that was essential. But the Iranians would much rather be cursing out Russia than gritting their teeth and calling them our allies and our friends and etc. So Russia has no allies. It has no successful foreign adventures, as it were. It tried to basically regain its position of actually put influence in the stands, the 5 nations that were created out of Central Asia when the Soviet Union broke up. But that was a failure because Russia had the money. I mean, China had the money. China was basically spending it, investing it, and even in the Russian Far East, Vladivostok and all those areas around Manchuria, the Russians could not keep the Chinese out. The Chinese, economic invaders, as it were. If you want, cheap, fairly high quality goods, you buy Chinese. The Chinese will bring in their own workers, and there's a huge labor shortage in the Russian Far East because Russians never wanted to live there in a big way. So you have, basically the Chinese are going to take over the Russian Far East without an invasion because they're basically buying it. They're taking it over economically, and one day they'll simply, tell Russia, you're no longer running this place. What are you going to do about it? And there's not much they can do. So the Russian foreign policy, in real terms, has been a disaster. They have no allies. They have no real friends. But the only thing Putin's got going is this: he basically stoked the flames of rebuild our empire, and that's not going to happen.
Austin, you talked a little bit about the Ukraine. Would you like to cover a couple of other areas?
I think Jim hit the essential parts in Syria. I mean, that's certainly an active theater. The attempts to undermine meddle, MEDDLE, which is a word we've applied to Iran, but also applied to Russia, at subversion. In some ways, Putin is continuing Soviet-era subversion in the West. That's something the Nordics, Norway, and Sweden use that term. Estonia uses it. The Poles do as well. As a matter of fact, Theresa May pointed that out in the attempted assassination using chemical weapons that occurred on British territory. Needless to say, that's classic KGB type wet work. In the West, wet meaning a way that there assassination, blood, but in this case, of course, they were using a chemical weapon, a chemical attack on British soil. Russia involvement in American elections in 2016, subversion attempt to create as much chaos and animosity in the American body politic as possible. That was a pretty successful operation in many ways. Played both sides against the middle, especially if you can co-opt the media. The major media, which was co-opted, that is going to become increasingly evident, I think, throughout this year and into 2020. But then co-optation of American media by the Kremlin is not anything new. Remember 1983 and the so-called Euro missile crisis, which really was stirred up by the Soviet Union, by the Kremlin, by deploying SS-20 triple warhead missiles. But the way it was flipped in a lot of major media in the U.S. is that Ronald Reagan was trying to start a nuclear war in Europe, which was just pure de-hokum. And then you think about, if you're aware of it, was it Walter Durante? That was the fellow's name, wasn't it, Jim? I don't have that. Yeah, okay.
Pulitzer Prize winner, Durante.
Jim's right on time. Okay, I was sure of this. Heck, I've actually written about it, but I haven't. And I mentioned it in Cocktails from Hell. But he won a Pulitzer Prize for covering up the starvation of Ukrainians and other small farmers and landholders in the Soviet Union. He was reporting for the New York Times. That complete co-optation. The British figured it out, tried to say something about it. I mean, and Durante apparently, I mean, this is, I don't think it's anecdotal. There's pretty good evidence that Durante even admitted it to a British Foreign Office official in Moscow. So the Russians have been trying to subvert and undermine the United States, well, possibly since the 1920 election. but that's certainly active in the 1930s here in the U.S. 2016 wasn't really anything different, except it was actually it wasn't anything different. Well, trying to sow discord and doubt about the integrity of the American electoral system. There is no integrity in the Russian system. There is in the U.S., but it was a psychological attack. So that is something that goes on in. If I said it was in 24 countries, I'm probably underestimating it by half. 4 dozen, 50. The Russians have a finger in subversive activity. Venezuela is a Russian theater of operations because allegedly there are 100. No, not allegedly. It's the State Department told Russia. Let's see, it was either last weekend or maybe it was on this past Sunday to get their 100 special operations troops out. There are also some mercenaries in there, I believe. Well, they're what are they? Contractors is what the term the Russians use. Most of those fellows, from what we can tell, are former Russian senior security personnel or special operations forces. So that's another place that they're operating. And then Central African Republic. How could I leave that out, Mr. Dunnigan? You know I'm not going to. There's no way. All right, look.
Most of the military contractors, which they even had to use in Syria.
They're not all military contractors. There are Russian personnel in there, a handful. There are a couple of reports on that. I believe I read one on Reuters, and it's within the last 2 weeks. But I think that because there is a base on a former government car government. I don't know how it was described. A land owned by the car government with some buildings on it that is in Bangui that is being used as a Russian military training facility. Now, I know it's mostly contractors. I agree with that, but there are Russian military personnel in the Central African Republic. So there's another theater of operations for you, Dan. Why there? Well, a lot of chaos there. That might be a place where they could sell some weapons there. It's one of the jokes about the Central African Republic is there is no there. Well, there is. It's a lot of suffering and terrible chaos. There's also a UN peacekeeping force there, MINUSCA, which I write about it every so often, mention it at least in the Congo and Central Africa update. If I start, Jim's already mentioned their cooperation with Iran, and they're still active in elsewhere in the near abroad, Transnistria, Kazakhstan. 2 months ago, there were even talks about the Russian subversion in Belarus. The white Russians, their ethnic kin. Why? Well, let's go back to something that shows up on strategy page quite a bit, the Rubik. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan. Now, I first used that as a quip in a couple of speeches I gave in the 90s, though it was based on something that Jim and I did when we were gaming a revitalized Soviet Union for, I think it was the second edition of A Quick and Dirty Guide to War, which came out about the time right after the Soviet Union fell apart. But if you want a global superpower, you want Russia's resources, Ukraine's agricultural and industrial resources, Kazakhstan additional oil and gas, and also population, and Belarus more people. You have enough people and enough a broad range of power to be a credible global power. And of course, it's a bad joke because it's like Rubik's Cube, that old puzzle. RUBIK is what it was. You move it around and you solve the puzzle. Well, to rebuild a Russian global, credible, great power, you got a puzzle to solve. And as Jim has pointed out, and I have, Vlad has not solved that puzzle. But Belarus would be, as I said, part of solving the puzzle of returning Russia to full great power status.
Well, I guess we'll watch the last chapters here of the decline of Vlad the Imploder.
I like that. Did you like that, Joe?
Yeah, I do. So we'll talk to you both later.
All right, bye, guys.
Indeed.
Bye.
Take care.